Thank you all for being here, and I especially want to thank Wolfgang and Avital for everything they did to make my visit possible. I've very much enjoyed the workshop I've been teaching these days, and while it's always nice to be able to share one's obsessions, it's particularly nice to be able to do it here. I thought that since I've been leading a series of discussions on the relation between literature and photography, that I would deliver a part of an essay on the memoirs of the French photographer, the 19th century French photographer, Nadar, that's forthcoming in a collection of my essays on art and photography entitled Paper Graveyards. Although the collection doesn't include all the essays I've written in the last 12 years on photography, the essays form a kind of constellation around a series of related themes, including the relations among images, writing, memory, ruins, death, mourning, and the technical media. The title of the collection is taken from a passage that Benjamin cites in the final section of his Trauspiel book, and that identifies our being with images of death. And the citation reads, "If we consider the innumerable corpses with which partly the ravages of the plague and partly the weapons of war have filled not only our Germany, but almost the whole of Europe, then we must admit that our roses have been transformed into thorns, our lilies into nettles, our paradises into cemeteries, indeed our whole being into an image of death. It is therefore my hope that it will not be held against me that in this general theater of death, I have not refused to set up my own paper graveyard," end quote. Like Benjamin, but against the background of the general theater of death that characterizes our own historical moment, a moment defined by wars and conflicts of all kinds, economic, civic, political, ethnic, cultural, and religious, I have wanted to set up my own paper graveyards. And the lecture I'm going to give tonight is a fragment of one of these paper cemeteries. Its title is Nadar's Photographopolis, and it begins with a citation from Krakauer's 1927 essay, Photography. "The world itself has taken on a photographic face. It can be photographed because it strives to be completely reducible to the spatial continuum that yields to snapshots. What the photographs by their sheer accumulation attempt to banish is the recollection of death, which is part and parcel of every memory image. The world has become a photographable present, and the photographed present has been entirely eternalized. Seemingly ripped from the clutch of death, in reality it has succumbed to it all the more." 1. In a fragment belonging to the posthumous text on the concept of history, a fragment entitled The Dialectical Image that cites a passage from André Monglon, Walter Benjamin writes, "If one looks upon history as a text, then what is valuable in it is what a recent author says of literary texts. The past has left in them images which can be compared to those held fast in a light-sensitive plate. Only the future has developers at its disposal that are strong enough to allow the image to come to light in all its details. Many a page in Marivaux or Rousseau reveals a secret sense which the contemporary reader cannot have deciphered completely. This historical method is a philological one, whose foundation is the book of life. To read what was never written," Hofmannsthal says, "the reader to be thought of here is the true historian," end quote. Although Monglon suggests that history can be likened to the process wherein a photograph is produced in order to hold a memory fast, Benjamin complicates the comparison by introducing a series of comparisons into it. As David Ferris has noted, if we include the opening conditional phrase, "if one looks upon history as a text," the sentence makes 3 comparisons. The first, hypothetical, makes history and a text equivalent to one another. The second compares a text to a photographic plate. The third, by accepting the terms of the first hypothetical comparison, would offer knowledge of the initial subject of this whole sequence, history. The logic enacted by these comparisons, he goes on to say, takes the form of a syllogism that can be expressed as follows. If history is comparable to a text, and a text is comparable to a photographic plate, then history is comparable to that same photographic plate. But what is properly historical here only reveals itself to a future generation capable of recognizing it. That is, a generation possessing developers strong enough to fix an image never seen before. This is what is so difficult to understand in Benjamin's account here, because the image that emerges already was there, but could not be seen, either when it was taken or in the intervening time. These images offer different degrees of detail. This is why there can be no image that does not involve a deviation or swerve. In the second entry to Convolute N of his Arcades project, Benjamin underlines the critical importance of this deviation to the historical aim of this project, while attributing its cause to time. He writes, "What for others are deviations are for me the data which determine my course. I base my reckoning on the differentials of time, which for others disturb the main lines of inquiry," end quote. To read what was never written, therefore, involves reading the deviations introduced by these differentials of time, something that Benjamin already had suggested when, in one of his earliest comments on Baudelaire, he says, "Let us compare time to a photographer, earthly time to a photographer who photographs the essence of things. But because of the nature of earthly time and its apparatus, the photographer manages only to register the negative of that essence on his photographic plates. No one can read these plates. No one can deduce from the negative on which time records the objects the true essence of things as they really are. Moreover, the elixir that might act as a developing agent is unknown," end quote. If we remain unable to develop these negatives, however, we still may be able to have, as Benjamin says Baudelaire can, a presentiment of its real picture, by registering that the dialectical image is to be read in language. What is legible in a dialectical image is a constellation of the then and now, but it is not a matter of the now reading the then. It is a matter of reading the then in the now, or more precisely, of reading the then now, which is what I wish to do now, here. I have begun with Benjamin, not simply because I wish to put what I will say about Nadar's memoirs under the sign of his name, nor simply because he has been one of Nadar's greatest readers. Benjamin repeatedly cites the memoirs in his writings on Baudelaire and in his Arcades project, but in order to suggest that if we have scarcely ever read Nadar's texts, it is perhaps because we have had to wait to be able to do so. What would be required for such a reading, Benjamin suggests, is a labor of reading that seeks to trace what has never been written or read, and to follow the wandering, deviating quality of the text, especially since it has been this wandering character that often has dissuaded readers from it. As Rosalind Krauss has noted, the memoirs are structured like a set of old wives' tales, as though a community had entrusted its archives to the local gossip. Of its 14 chapters, only one, The Primitives of Photography, really settles down to producing anything like a historical account. And although this is the longest chapter in the book, it comes nearly at the end, after an almost maddening array of peculiarly personal reminiscences, some of which bear a relation to the presumed subject that is tangential at best, end quote. Perhaps it is this quality of rambling anecdote, she adds, of arbitrary elaboration of what seem like irrelevant details, of a constant wandering away from what would seem to be the point that accounts for the book's relative obscurity, end quote. On the contrary, I would suggest, it may even be the itinerant range of his activities, photographer, writer, actor, caricaturist, and inventor, that has encouraged us to think of him as an artist rather than as a rigorous thinker. I would like to suggest, however, that even in writings that sometimes seem gossipy and capricious, we still can register an analytic power that makes this text one of the most exciting and exact writings on photography that we have. Presented in 14 vignettes, the text comes to us as a series of snapshots in prose, each of which offers us an allegory of different characteristics and features of the photographic world, what Nadar calls, in a discussion of his aeronautic experiences, the photographopolis. This photographopolis not only refers to Paris as a city that is entirely photographic. According to Nadar, it is not only photographed, but essentially photographic in nature, but to a world that, having become a series of images, is increasingly composed of proliferating copies, repetitions, reproductions, and simulacra. What interests me about the memoirs is not only the itinerancy of a camera that moves from Nadar's portrait studio to the streets of Paris, from Paris's catacombs to its aerial photographs of a Paris in transformation, but also the way in which Nadar's memoirs inscribe within its movement an entire constellation of photographic figures, as if photography itself had traveled into his language. Indeed, what is remarkable is that in a text that presumably is a record of his life as a photographer, an account of the history of photography from its beginnings to the time of the memoirs itself, Nadar does not reproduce a single photograph, as if to suggest that photographs are unnecessary in a text that is photographic in form. Indeed, Nadar's text performs, within the itinerancy of its language, what it wants to convey to us about the history of photography and about photography itself. The memoirs appear as a machine of repetition, since several of the texts that compose it already had been published by Nadar earlier, even if he sometimes alters them slightly, as if it were a palimpsestic anthology of his previous writings, but also of the text he cites and recirculates in his. This is simply to say that the text is itself a constellation of then and now that seeks to offer a history of photography in the 19th century and beyond. Nadar's text is not a chronicle, however, since it does not offer a sequence of chronological events, a historical record in which the facts are narrated without adornment or any attempt at literary style. It is, in Benjamin's sense, a question of Darstellung, a matter of representation, presentation, performance, and in a chemical sense that Nadar would have appreciated, of recombination. Written in sections, and therefore moving forward in accordance with a series of interruptions, Nadar's memoirs enact a method of representation that proceeds like a performance in the mode of digression and detour. Each of his little vignettes is therefore an opening onto the reading labyrinth that is at once his life and text. Like Benjamin, he knew that memory is not an instrument for exploring the past, but rather a medium, a kind of theater, in which remembrance is staged and performed. Indeed, he stages the play among his life, his text, and the act of remembrance in the very title of his memoirs, When I Was a Photographer. Since we know that he took photographs throughout the entirety of his life, the past tense of the title suggests that the memoirs are written after his death, from beyond the grave. No longer simply alive, but not yet entirely dead, or rather at the threshold of life and death, dead but still writing. Nadar writes, but as a dead man. In doing so, he suggests that photography names a dispossession, that dividing him from himself, telling us that living and death are inseparable, figures his death by anticipating it. 2. Nadar's memoirs open with an account of the reactions and responses to the invention of photography entitled Balzac and the Daguerreotype. In Nadar's telling, photography appeared in the form of a series of questions that, challenging all of our presuppositions, ask us to reconceptualize the relations between perception and memory, life and death, and presence and absence. In response to its arrival, people were said to be stupefied, stunned, fixed in place. They are arrested, in other words, as if in a photograph. For Nadar, the introduction of photography transforms everyone into a kind of photograph, and perhaps especially when one resists posing in front of a camera. This is why, even though photography, electricity, and aeronautics are for Nadar the premier emblems of modernity, belonging as they do to the innumerable inventions produced by what he calls the greatest scientific century, nothing is more extraordinary than photography, since it extends the limits of the possible and responds to the desire to make material the impalpable specter that vanishes as soon as it is seen, leaving not even a shadow on the mirror. End quote. That photography requires that there be such things as phantoms and ghosts is confirmed in what is perhaps the most famous passage in this section, one in which Nadar refers to Balzac's theory of specters and in particular to the spectrality of photographic images. In Convolute Y of his Arcades project, Benjamin explains that Nadar reproduces the Balzacian theory of the daguerreotype, which in turn derives from the Democritean theory of the idola, end quote. Benjamin does not cite his source, but he clearly refers to the following passage from Nadar's opening vignette. According to Balzac, each body in nature is composed of a series of layers of specters in infinitely superimposed strata, foliated in infinitesimal pellicules in all directions in which the optic perceives the body. Since man is unable to create, that is to constitute from an apparition, from the impalpable, a solid thing, or to make something from nothing, every Daguerrean operation catches, detaches, and retains by applying onto itself one of the layers of the photographed body. It follows that for that body, and with every repeated operation, there is an evident loss of one of its specters, which is to say, of a portion of its constitutive essence, end quote. As Balzac would have it, then, all bodies are made up entirely of layers of ghost-like images. Every time someone is photographed, a spectral layer is removed from the body and transferred to the photograph. Repeated exposures therefore lead to the loss of subsequent ghostly layers. Benjamin makes clear that he is aware of Balzac's theory by citing a little later in the same convolute a passage from Balzac's own Cousin Poin. If anyone had come and told Napoleon that a man or a building is incessantly and at all hours represented by an image in the atmosphere, he would have consigned him to Charenton as a lunatic. Yet that is what Daguerre's discovery proved. Just as physical objects in fact project themselves onto the atmosphere, so that it retains the specter which the daguerreotype can fix and capture, in the same way ideas imprint themselves in what we must call the atmosphere of the spiritual world, and live on in it spectrally, end quote. As Balzac suggests, photographic images are based on ghostly images that emanate from physical objects themselves and are then captured by the camera. Balzac here presents the outline of an idolic theory of images. As Benjamin's comment on Nadar suggests, this theory already had been elaborated in antiquity in the work of Democritus, and as he notes in his Berlin Chronicle, by Epicurus. The most extensive and influential account of Epicurus's writings on the image can be found in Book 4 of Lucretius's De Rerum Natura. There, Lucretius describes, quote, the paradoxical nature of simulacra, or as the Greeks call them, idola, those images that appear in the mind or for which there are no counterparts in the outside world. Projections and dreams, fantasies, and that category of non-existent beings that flit through the air, willy-nilly, drawn from the outermost surface of things. These simulacra are the outer shapes of things that constitute a film they throw off in the world, end quote. According to Lucretius, objects are incessantly represented by an image in the atmosphere, and therefore appear there as a kind of specter. But more precisely, objects are represented by a series of images, by an almost inconceivably rapid sequence of discrete filmic images emanating from the object and serving as a filter for the viewer. Objects and bodies are therefore condensed composites of multiple layers of images, and this means that there is no such thing as an image that would be closed or self-identical to itself. This insight holds for all images, but it is especially legible in the portraits that help to secure Nadar's reputation as a photographer, since they always presume that the image before us is already multiple and from the very beginning. Benjamin makes a similar point when he cites Brecht in the Arcades project. With the older, less light-sensitive apparatus, multiple expressions would appear on the plate, which was exposed for rather long periods of time, yielding a livelier and more universal expression. By comparison, the newer devices no longer compose the faces. But must faces be composed? Perhaps for these new devices, there is a photographic method which would decompose faces, end quote. This decomposition of the face, of the many faces that were photographed by Nadar, seems to result from the accumulation of multiple layers of more or less instant images. We might even say that insofar as the portraits present a temporal stratification of multiple images, none of which are ever just one, the subject's face is never simply a face, but an archive of the network of relations that have helped constitute this particular face and body. The pose it adopts, the clothes it wears, the look it takes, and what it wishes to mime. Nadar himself suggests that the portrait always must bear within it just such a network, however invisible it may remain, and even if its traces are encrypted within the photograph's surface. Quote, "Photography is a marvelous discovery, a science that occupies the highest intelligences, an art that sharpens the most sagacious minds, and the application of which is within the reach of any imbecile. The theory of photography can be learned in an hour, and the elements of practicing it in a day. What cannot be learned is the sense of light, an artistic appreciation for the effects produced by different and combined sources of light, the application of this or that effect according to the physiognomy that as an artist you must reproduce. What can be learned even less is the moral understanding of the subject, that instant tact which puts you in communication with the model, helps you to sum him up, guides you to his habits, his ideas, according to his character, and enables you to give not an indifferent reproduction, banal or accidental, such as any laboratory assistant could achieve, but the most convincing and sympathetic likeness and intimate resemblance," end quote. As we can see, though, this intimate resemblance, or portrait, requires that the photographer be able to read what is not visible on the surface of the face or body of the person before him, what was never written in it, but which nevertheless has left behind its traces. Like the face and body, the photographic portrait is also a palimpsest to be read, a kind of archive. It always bears several memories at once. It is never closed. To say this, however, is perhaps also to say that every photograph is already, in advance, part of a series or network, even if this web of relations remains unnameable and indeterminate, and is generally not emphasized as it is here. Nadar's understanding of his portraits may even tell us what is true of every photograph. Every photograph is already fissured by its own seriality, but a seriality that, like the innumerable ghostly layers that form the skins or films of the body in Lucretius and later in Balzac, cannot be understood in terms of succession, since they are constantly separating themselves out of things, even as they condition our perception. This multiplicity and seriality are legible in Nadar's next vignette, since it too is a story of ghostly photographic repetitions. 3. Nadar opens the second section of his memoirs, Gars Avenged, by reproducing a letter he presumably had received 20 years earlier in 1856 from the owner of the Café of the Grand Theatre in Pau. In the letter, the owner, named Gazebon, claims that a Mr. Mauclair, an actor in transit in our city, has in his possession a daguerreotyped portrait of himself that was supposed to have been taken of him by Nadar in Paris while he remained in Aubon. Gazebon writes to Nadar to request the photographer take a photograph of him from Paris while he remains in Pau, and to do so by the same electric process that had produced the image of Mauclair. He requests that the portrait be taken in color, and if possible, while he is seated at a table in his billiards hall. He promises Nadar that he will display the portrait prominently within his establishment, and that because his cafe is frequented by the best society, including a large number of English gentlemen and their ladies, this commission will bring Nadar even greater visibility than he already has. Nadar claims to reproduce the original letter here. But of course, what we have before us is only its reproduction in a memoir. Nevertheless, Nadar quickly remembers that this original is a reproduction in yet another sense, since it has its own precedent in a letter that Gazebon has sent to him 2 years ago, again prompted by Mauclair, who was already then in transit in our city, inquiring about the value of a gilded copper engraving, of which, according to Mauclair, Nadar possessed the only other one of its kind. Nadar tells us that he never replied to this original letter, and he also decides not to answer Casaubon's most recent request. That this opening scene begins in the oscillation between singularity and repetition, seeing and not seeing, remembering and forgetting, and with a structure of citation that will punctuate the entire story, suggests the repetitions and circulations that structure what I elsewhere have called the citational character of photography itself. Its capacity to double, repeat, reproduce, and multiply what is already doubled, reproduced, and multiple, and in doing so suggests that what is to come will tell us something about the nature of photography. Indeed, immediately after having declared his decision not to reply to this second letter, this double of the first one, Nadar offers us a twilight scene that will serve as a setting for the rest of the section, and in which we can begin to read another series of doubling photographic effects. He writes, "Can you imagine anything more satisfying than those moments of rest before the evening meal after a long day's work? Driven from bed before dawn by the preoccupations of work, the man hasn't stopped acting and thinking. He has given everything he can, without counting, struggling against a fatigue that becomes more oppressive as the day goes on. And it is only at sundown, when the time of liberation rings, the time for everyone to stop, that the main door of the house finally closed, he gives himself grace, granting a truce until tomorrow to his overexhausted members and brain. It is this sweet hour par excellence when, rendered to himself at last, he stretches himself as much as he can in the chair of his choice, recapitulating the fruit of his day's labor. Yes, but even though our main door is closed, the back door always remains half open. And if our good luck is to be perfect that day, he will come to us for some good, intimate, comforting banter. He, one of those whom we love more than anybody else and who loves us, one of those whom our thought always follows, since their thought is always with us. In the same way, the person who fell upon me was one of the most beloved and best, with the most alert and clear spirit, one of the most brilliant flowers cited in Parisian conversation, my excellent Edal de Page. And how nicely our little tete-a-tete was shaping up, leaving fatigue and all the rest far behind, until, that is, a visitor is announced to us," end quote. There would be much to say about this remarkable scene, but in this context, I simply wish to accent that it takes place at sundown, at this liminal moment between day and night, and light and darkness, and therefore within a photographic temporality and topos. Moreover, in this transitional moment, and in the context of several other threshold figures, especially the several doors Nadar mentions, the shift in pronouns from you to he to I to we, suggests a self that, like Mauclair, is always in transit, always itinerantly passing from one self to another, never simply self-identical to itself. And since in Nadar's Photographopolis, everyone is photographic, the characters in this vignette themselves become moving photographs. The entire scene stages, in the most theatrical sense, a self that, always on the move, can never be located precisely. Indeed, at this moment in which the self relaxes, stretches itself, perhaps even across other selves, Nadar makes it impossible for us to know if the allegorically named Edal de Page, the one who announces writing to come, actually arrives in person, or if he is a double of Nadar who simply enters through the always open back door of his unconscious. Nevertheless, whether Edal de Page is a visitor who falls upon Nadar at this twilight hour, or an internal double, Nadar presents a self whose identity is essentially linked to and dissolved in relation to this other. Divided from itself because it is inhabited by an other, because bearing this trace of the other, this self is no longer simply itself. The multiplicity of this self will be confirmed later in the story, and in relation to what happens when one enters a photographic space. Moreover, that we have already entered this photographic space is reinforced by the details that will be revealed in the ensuing encounter with the announced visitor. The visitor is a 20-year-old young man. He claims that he has to speak to Nadar, and that although he would have returned until he found him, he felt able to insist on seeing him today because of the connections they already share. The young man's mother used to work for Nadar's mother, and they also both share a friend, Léopold Leclanché, who recently died. Insofar as mothers are always another name for photography, mothers and photography are both means of reproduction, and mourning is the photographic experience par excellence. What we learn here is that even before they meet, their relation is mediated by the photographic. That the young man was born in the year that Nadar received the letter from Gazebon requesting that Nadar take this self-portrait from afar, is entirely fitting too, since as we soon will discover, the young man has come to ask Nadar to sponsor his new discovery of long-range photography. After providing Nadar with an account of his experience in the sciences and in several new technological advances, including the velocipede, electronic chronometers, the telephone, and more recently, photophony, the young man asked Nadar to consider his story. Suppose for a moment, sir, simply for the sake of argument, as impossible as it may sound to you, but you above all don't have to be reminded that pure mathematics aside, the great Arago refused to accept the word impossible. Suppose that a person or an object, anything you like, were in this room at this moment, while your camera technician was in his laboratory, on the same floor or any other floor in the building, absolutely separated and isolated from the object he ignores, that he has not even seen, and that he has no need of seeing. Suppose that a photograph could be taken under these strict conditions of segregation, before your very eyes, over this relatively short distance. Would you then grant the possibility of doing the same thing over considerably greater distances? End quote. While Nadar immediately responds to the young man by stiffening, "I dared not move a muscle," he says, becoming in this way himself a kind of photographic effect. Dupage springs up and exclaims, "Do you claim to be able to take photographs across any distances and of objects that you cannot even see?" To which the young man replies, "I do not claim to be able to do so, sir. I already have done it. I haven't invented anything. I've only found something that already was there." End quote. The young man then produces a torn page from a review of his experiment, and Nadar and Dupage read the following account. At 2 o'clock last Sunday afternoon, in the town hall in Montmartre, a most curious experiment took place. A young man, having obtained the necessary authorization, demonstrated for the first time publicly his method of electrical photography, with which ingenious process he is able to photograph persons or things beyond his field of vision. The inventor asserted that from Montmartre he could photograph the town of Douai. His Honor the Mayor and several municipal councillors were on hand, as well as 2 or 3 residents of Douai. Pronunciation, you'll forgive me. This is one word I can never pronounce, and it's of course the word that is at the heart of what I'm going to talk about, who were to indicate the places to be photographed. Several exposures were made in rapid succession, and the finished pictures were produced at once. The sites represented were immediately recognized by the party from Douai. Houses, trees, and people standing out with remarkable clarity. End quote. The allegory of photography that Nadar wishes to stage here increasingly becomes vertiginously self-reflexive, since beyond the claim that the young man can photograph what he cannot see, that photography can make the invisible visible, what is remarkable here is that the young man photographs a town called simply Douai, which of course means mourning. That the town does not exist confirms its allegorical character. In taking a photograph of mourning, the photographer not only takes a photograph of an experience that we know to be at the heart of photography, mourning. Mourning may even be another name for photography, but he also takes a photograph of photography itself. In reaction to this photograph, both Nadar and Dupage are speechless and stunned again frozen as if in a kind of photograph, as if this photographic revelation itself transforms them into photographs. This transformation is reinforced in the following remarkable passage, in which Nadar makes clear that when one enters a photographic space, and at this point in the story, there is no other kind of space, one always advances as an other, and indeed as multiple others. Quote, "Yes, of course, I gave in. I would have relented long before if I had not been imperatively arrested by a singular hallucination. Suddenly, as often occurs with optical illusions and certain cases of double vision, the noble features of Eral's face seemed to merge with those of the young worker, becoming a kind of diabolical mask which slowly took on the disquieting form of a face I had never seen before, but that I recognized immediately. Mauclair, Machiavellian Mauclair, in transit in our city. The electric image mockingly reared its head at me from the country of Henry IV, and I seemed to become Gazebon, yes, Gazebon the gullible. I could see myself seated in my cafe, in Pau, still waiting for the portrait to be taken by the electric process by Mr. Nadar in Paris. In the meantime, to pass the time, I raised a toast to the best society, including English gentlemen and their ladies," end quote. That every self here becomes someone else, and even more than one other, suggests the continual distortions and displacements from which the photographic subject emerges, but always as an other. In experiencing the other's alterity, for example, Nadar experiences the alteration that in him infinitely displaces and delimits his singularity. This movement of disfiguration, linked to the chiasmic plurality of the passage's interwoven figures, makes it impossible to say who speaks the rest of the story. Where everyone can become someone else, for example, in the aleatory ghostly space of photography, no one is ever simply himself. It is because figures always are haunted by other figures, always are bearing the traces of the other, that they are always themselves and not themselves at the same time. What gets signaled here is not only the structure of photography in general, a structure that names the loss of identity that attends the entry into photographic space, but also a mode of writing that performs at the level of its sentences and words what it wants us to understand. This becomes clearer when, after the young man leaves, Nadar is left appreciating his performance. He suggests that the young man was simply following a script that would permit him to trick Nadar and his sometimes mouthpiece, Erald. What a consummate artist, he tells Erald. His entrance, modest and reserved, his attire simple and unaffected, all quite perfect. Preliminary topic, sentimental evocation of two mothers, a strategy that never fails. In the ingratiating exordium, the elaborate oratorical paraphernalia, the endless lists of facts and dates, difficult to verify on the spot, which he manipulates like a circus performer, the flattery, a bit obvious but always appropriate, and to achieve the well-ordered whole, what endurance, what amazing discipline, and from one still so young, end quote. A theater, Nadar reminds us, is always also a place of memory and anticipation, where what has been is rehearsed and repeated as what is to come. The story ends with a reminder, that is, of the citational character of the young man, and by implication, of all of us. We live, Nadar seems to suggest, within quotation marks in relation to both mourning and photography. 4. That this citational structure can be linked to the madness of a mimesis gone wild is elaborated in Nadar's 4th vignette, Homicidal Photography. Even within a peculiar set of stories, this 4th story is a particularly strange and intense allegory of photography's capacity to address and enact violence, and of its political, policial, and juridical context. In it, Nadar tells the story of a pharmacist who, with the help of his wife and his younger brother, murders his wife's lover. While the story seems somewhat distant from Nadar himself, it is one of the few vignettes that does not present him as its primary character. It nevertheless encrypts several references to his own capacity to influence his younger brother, and therefore touches on the sometimes violent force of mimesis in general, and perhaps even the murderous character of the photographer himself. Even if the story did not reference the nature of Nadar's own photographic desires, along with his relation to his brother, Adrien, it would be difficult to say that it is entirely fictional, and indeed neither the characters nor the story are the products of Nadar's imagination. As Jérôme Pelot has noted, and I owe much of the historical account that follows to his rehearsal of it, and indeed my language often photographs his account, Nadar's readers would have recognized in the story a murder that had been widely reported in several newspapers and books, since the particular details and horror of the Fénérou affair had been widely circulated to the public through the press and various scandal sheets. The murder of the pharmacist, Louis Aubert, premeditated by the Fénérou couple with the help of Marie Fénérou's younger brother, occurred on May 18, 1882. The investigation identified the cadaver in the Seine on June 7, and the event was sensationalized from that day until the end of the trial, which lasted from August 9th to 12th. Only Marie Fénérou, also a pharmacist and therefore already a double of his victim, is condemned to death. His wife is sentenced to forced labor for life, and the younger brother to forced labor for 7 years. Nadar knew all of this when he wrote his text in 1892, especially since many images of the events had circulated, including images of everyone involved in the matter and of the scene of the crime itself. Nevertheless, because he does not disclose the names and details of the case until the end of his retelling, the characters appear to be fictional. If he delays any allusion to the actual events, it is partly because he reads the affair as a kind of self-portrait in which the pharmacist and the criminal, in the story these two can be the same person, become figures for the photographer, and even for this particular photographer. Indeed, it is because the pharmacist is a figure for the photographer that Nadar can tell us that the pharmacist is not there. Having left his studies in medicine, Nadar is like the pharmacist who, having wanted to be a doctor, is now only a would-be doctor. Moreover, in the same way that the pharmacist manipulates drugs in his laboratory and can either cure or poison his clients, the photographer also manipulates substances and chemicals and can either produce a good likeness or a bad one. If Nadar is attracted to the story, then, it is because it encrypts several references to his familial history and to his photographic practice. Insofar as Nadar focuses on the way in which the pharmacist exerts a controlling influence over his brother, he witnesses his brother Adrien's own fate and registers the extent to which his force and influence may have affected his brother. Indeed, Nadar first begins writing his account only a few months after Adrien is committed to a mental institution in 1890, and may have done so not only because he saw in the criminal pharmacist an allegory of the photographer, but also because he saw in the story the drama of a younger brother driven to madness because of his inability to resist the elder brother's force. That Nadar considered the more psychological dimensions of the story is confirmed by his evocation of Hippolyte Bernheim's theory of hypnosis and suggestion in the postscript that he adds to his tale. We can see here that the suggested power that Felix has over Adrien corresponds to the relation between the husband and his wife, the lover and his mistress, the murderer and his accomplices, and finally between the photograph of the cadaver and the crowd that is mobilized in relation to it. The metaphor of this hypnotic form of mimesis, described as having a crushing force, eventually determines the description of the cadaver in the photographic image. Quote, "A month, 6 weeks after the evening at Poissy, a sailor under the bridge catches with his hook an unformed mass, a hideous apparition in the silt. It is the cadaver of someone who drowned in total putrefaction, so abominably fashioned that the human form becomes illegible. Never had decomposition by death resulted in something more horrible than this heap without a name, this infamous carrion, disemboweled, so deliquescent as to make even a gravedigger faint." End quote. In this dead body, emerging from the waters of death into the light, exposed to the looks cast on it, immediately followed by the horror of this disastrous apparition. In all of this, we cannot but recognize, analogously, another hideous apparition. In Belot's words, the one in the watery solution of the photographer's basin, the image that trembles under the avid gaze, the imprint on wet paper where the human appearance, arrested by the lens, cadaverized by the shot, and misrecognized by the blind and cold apparatus of the photographic operation, arises deformed, dreary, and crushed. The cadaver caught in the Seine evokes the dead body that appears in the photographic exposure. This cadaver bears the imprints of physical abuse, as the photograph the imprints of what it represents, end quote. The cadaver is a photograph, and because of it, we can identify the man whose body has been found, and we can track down his murderers. While people try to figure out what happened, the police photograph the horror. The fascination with the cadaver results from the suggestion of the photographer. Indeed, the malady of images proliferates and multiplies in a society ruled by suggestion, and photography intensifies the contagion's drift through society. Like crime, photography proceeds with imprints on malleable matter. The wife, captivated by her husband, was inert, Nadar tells us, like wax that is ready to be molded. The wax to be molded is a figure for the subjection of the young brother to the older one, the wife to the husband, the man to the idea, and the body to the image. The victim's body, but also the precipitated social body. Since yesterday, we've been crushed in the telegraph office of the Figaro, and all of Paris passes by, Nadar writes. Paris and the whole world pass by here, moved by photography's hypnotic power. If Nadar expresses his fear here, he also opposes these seductions of violence with a moral anti-photographic exigency. But such is the trouble with justice itself, since it is called that before the cursed image of perpetrated crime, this photographic proof finds itself supplementing everything else. It determines everything, end quote. It is the photograph that just announced the sentence, he notes, the sentence without appeal to death, end quote. Here again, Nadar adds nothing. A photograph of the cadaver, in fact, was taken, and the negatives were displayed publicly. Even the idea of the crowd thirsting for vengeance like a deceived husband, led like the wife by the husband, the crowd which is set in motion by the authoritative fixity of the fixed image which pronounced the sentence. Even this idea is not Nadar's. What Nadar witnesses here, and what he elaborates elsewhere in his memoirs, is, according to Belot, the birth of a modern journalism that invents the mutual reinforcement of words and images in its production of contagious opinion, end quote. It is in this way, he suggests, that photography displays its homicidal tendencies. These tendencies also account for why the memoirs are littered with corpses. From the body of Le Plancher, that serves a mediating function between Nadar and the young inventor of long-range photography, to the corpse of the pharmacist's lover, to the corpse whose body lies in the funeral home scene that opens the vignette entitled The Professional Secret, and to the millions of corpses that populate the Parisian catacombs to which we now can turn. When Baudelaire refers in Spleen 2 to a pyramid, an immense vault, which contains more bodies than the common pit, a cemetery abhorred by the moon, he is referring to what, in a passage cited by Benjamin in his Arcades project, François Pochet calls the ancient ossuaries, now leveled or entirely gone, swallowed up in the sea of time with all their dead, like ships that have sunk with all their crew aboard, end quote. These ossuaries point to another city in the midst of Paris, a city whose inhabitants far outnumber the living beings of the metropolis above, the underground catacombs. The creation of the municipal ossuary beneath the city corresponds almost exactly to the timing of the revolution. Ordered in 1784 by the Conseil d'État and opened the following year, the catacombs were meant to relieve the stress on the cemetery of the innocents, and even more successfully than the revolution, created a kind of equality that could not be found above ground. As Nadar puts it in his account of his photographic descent into the Parisian underground, In this confused equality that is death, the Merovingian kings maintain an eternal silence, side by side with the victims of the massacre of September 92. Valois, Bourbon, Orléans, and Stuarts haphazardly accomplished their decomposition, lost among malingerers, and the 2,000 of the religion put to death on St. Bartholomew's Day. Moreover, he adds, celebrated figures from Marat to Robespierre, from Saint-Just to Danton, and from Mirabeau to Lemaitre, all succumbed to the anonymity of the catacombs. By the late 19th century, the catacombs contained the remains of nearly 11 million Parisians. In his memoirs, Nadar refers to this underground city as a necropole, a city of the dead. Like photography, Paris, as a city that exists both above and below ground, names the intersection of life and death. Nadar took his camera underground into the catacombs and the sewers in 1861. Experimenting with electric light, much of his account details the difficulties and challenges he encountered. Among so many other things, Nadar's underground work literalizes the relation between photography and death that he already had signaled in the earlier vignettes, and that he understands to belong to photography's signature. Whether the bones are put haphazardly on top of one another, or whether they are neatly organized, the catacombs present to us are signs of our mortality. But as Christopher Prendergast has noted, Nadar's lighting sometimes gives a bizarrely polished look to some of the skulls, which transports us back into the world of the Grand Magasin, as if the skulls were so many shining spectral commodities placed on display, end quote. This is not the only reminder of the above-ground city in Nadar's underground, however. The skeletal remains also recall the masked faces in the opera or theater. These theatrical resonances are reinforced by Nadar's use of mannequins to represent workers in his photographs. As Nadar explains in a passage that Benjamin cites in his Arcades project. With each new camera setup, we had to test our exposure time empirically. Certain of the plates were found to require up to 18 minutes. Remember, we were still at that time using collodion and emulsion on glass negatives. I had judged it advisable to animate some of these scenes by the use of a human figure, less from considerations of picturesqueness than in order to give a sense of scale, a precaution too often neglected by explorers in this medium and with sometimes disconcerting consequences. For these 18 minutes of exposure time, I found it difficult to obtain from a human being the absolute inorganic immobility I required. I tried to get round this difficulty by means of mannequins, which I dressed in workman's clothes and positioned in the scene with as little awkwardness as possible. This business did nothing to complicate our task, end quote. While the mannequins were meant to add to the photograph's realism, they instead accent the image's theatricality. Presumably working to order the remains of the dead, they, along with the images in which they appear, evoke the tradition of vanitas, something Nadar himself suggests in his memoirs. In this world in which the boundaries between life and death, or persons and things, have begun to blur, the mannequins who push wagons, shovels, and bones in numerous pictures suggest the death in life on which Nadar so often insists, the shadowy transitoriness and finitude of all living beings, a finitude whose traces are unable to be erased either in life or in death. This is why Nadar emphasizes the palimpsest-like relation between the underground network of tunnels and the above-ground network of streets. Nadar's Paris is always double, is always more than one, which is why, like the mannequins which serve as doubles for the workers, it is another name for repetition and citation, and perhaps for photography itself. 6. In his book, The Earth and the Air, Memories of the Giant, parts of which are incorporated into his later memoirs, Nadar explains that his interest in aerial photography grew out of his interest in mapping the city from a bird's eye view. When Nadar looked to the skies, however, as when he looked to the sewers and catacombs, he encountered more than anything else his finitude, even as he continued to wish he could exceed it. As he puts it, describing the sensation of being in the air above Paris. There, only complete detachment, real solitude. In the limitless immensity of these hospitable and benevolent spaces, where no human force, no power of evil can reach you, you feel yourself living for the first time, and the proud feeling of your liberty invades you. In this supreme isolation, in this superhuman spasm, the body forgets itself. It exists no longer. End quote. But amidst the clouds, when he looked down at his beloved city, instead of simply feeling that he was living for the first time, he registered and experienced another kind of death. The photographs show us what he saw: Paris as it existed in the late 1850s. That is, a Paris in transformation because of Haussmann's efforts to renovate and rebuild the city. Taking off from the Champ de Mars, Nadar's balloon flight enables him to glimpse the developments in the northwest of Paris that were meant to accommodate the wealthy bourgeoisie. The picture, entitled "The First Result of Aerostatic Photography," shows the new roads that were altering the city's identity, as well as buildings and landmarks, such as the Parc Monceau, Montmartre in the distance, and the Arc de Triomphe, all of which were now resituated and therefore redefined in the context of Paris's transformation. Another image shows the arch at the center of the Étoile, which was one of Haussmann's signature accomplishments, and which in our reading, in which stars belong to the history of photography, confirms Paris's photographic character. As Shirley Rice has suggested, in the clean sweep of their diagonals, in their geometrical organization, in their focus on crossroads and places of exchange, the photographs of Paris itself are indeed the doubles of the photographs of the underground. All of Nadar's documentary images of Paris, whether taken above or below the ground, are about dynamism, circulation, change, and as a result, about a new, thoroughly modern kind of death. End quote. But what is this death? This is the question that all photographs ask us to engage, and is legible everywhere in Nadar's photographic trajectory, and on each page of his memoirs. Indeed, his encounter with death is legible in the persistence for more than 4 decades with which he remained open to the photographic registration of ruins and death, including those ruins which are the mortal bodies that so often sat before his camera, which is why his studio can also be understood as a mortuary chamber, something he himself suggests in his memoirs. But it is also legible in the disappearance of the places and people that he photographed during this time. The world he photographed, including a Paris that belongs to the past, to yesterday, this Paris no longer exists. And already, even as he was photographing it, it was in the process of altering and disappearing. As Baudelaire would put it in The Swan, registering the transformations that Parisians living in the age of Haussmann witnessed every day. Old Paris is gone. No human heart changes half so fast as a city's face. Paris changes, he adds, but in sadness like mine, nothing stirs. New buildings, old neighborhoods turn to allegory, and memories weigh more than stone. Suggesting that Haussmann was destroying more than simply objects in space, Baudelaire also indicates that he was erasing and demolishing the repositories of memory images, the neighborhoods and stones that bore the traces of the city's history and memories. Creating a break with the past, he destined the now unmoored memories to wander aimlessly through the new metropolis. This is one of the reasons that photography, in its capacity to capture moments and places that are in the process of vanishing, became such an important medium during this period. In Benjamin's words, when one knows that something will soon be removed from one's gaze, that thing becomes an image. End quote. This is why Nadar's aerial photographs, and not only these, recall the traces and specificity of a particular culture and history, even as they inevitably mark the disappearance, loss, and ruin of this same culture and history. His images therefore bear an act of mourning, since it remains in love with a city that could be said to have died several times, even if it is still living, even if in its living it remains haunted by its past and its deaths. It is perhaps precisely this survival, precisely this living on, that reminds us that things pass, that they change and alter. And this is why throughout his literary and photographic career, Nadar always remained most interested in and most faithful to this process of change and transformation. Indeed, the very law that motivates and marks his writings and his photographs is this law of change and transformation. We could even say that in a certain sense, Nadar the photographer, because of his fidelity to the finitude and evanescence of things, already signals and bears the mourning of Paris. The city that, as he always suggested, belongs to death and according to different temporalities. This is why even the mourning of Paris, the mourning of a Paris that has disappeared and which shows the body of its ruins, but also the mourning of the Paris which he knows, even as he photographs it, will disappear tomorrow, is itself destined to pass away, but always in another act of mourning. Benjamin reinforces Nadar's sense of Paris's finitude when in Convolute C of his Arcades project, a section devoted to ancient Paris, catacombs, demolitions, and the decline of Paris, he cites Gustave Geoffroy's comments on Charles Merion's engravings of Paris, comments that could be used to describe Nadar's own photographs of Paris. His work as an engraver represents one of the profoundest poems ever written about a city. And what is truly original in all these striking pictures is that they seem to be the image, despite being drawn directly from life, of things that are finished, that are dead or about to die, end quote. But as Nadar also knew, it is not simply a matter of things disappearing, even in relation to the photographic act that would seek to preserve them, because there also is another form of mourning, one in which photographs capture scenes which, although visible today, will disappear tomorrow. Nadar knows that everything passes. The figures and peoples in his photograph, the sights, the objects, all these are destined to death. This is why within the world of Nadar's photographs, within his photographopolis, there is no photograph that is not associated with death, and why the sections of his memoirs on which I have touched here are everywhere marked by a sense of death. Whatever the represented thing may be, and even when death is not shown, it is still touched by death, by the fact of its passing. We know that even the sun, from which all photographs take their point of departure, will one day pass, will one day no longer cast its light on the earth. It is because photography belongs to the dying sun that for Nadar it belongs to Paris, the dying city of light. Paris is the city par excellence of photography. It is a photograph. And indeed, within Nadar's world, Paris and photography constitute themselves as the allegory of the other. And it is this Paris photograph that he thinks about every day. But what is it that happens within his imagination in relation to Paris? What is it that haunts him? What is it that encourages him to focus like a kind of camera on the relations among photography, death, and the day and night that touched each of his subjects? Nadar's photographs are the indices of his particular vision, the traces of a declaration of love. And if we listen to the silence of his photographs, we perhaps can hear him say, across this silence, and to the Paris and people he loved, and loved to photograph, even as they were vanishing, I can only find myself in relation to you, even though I know that because of this relation, I can never be simply myself. Obsessed with you and by you, I lose myself in the madness of a single desire, to alter time. I want nothing else than to arrest time, to stop it, to seal it within the surface of a photograph. I want nothing else than to archive and preserve within a series of photographs not only the speed of light, but also the night and oblivion, without which we could never see. And yes, the death and mourning, without which neither I nor you can be said to live. I want to touch and preserve this passing, this itinerancy which belongs to both life and death, mine and yours, and which offers me a series of shifting reflections, as if in water, in which I can see myself, but as the one who is no longer just myself, as the one who is no longer here.